Welcome to another edition of The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a text that is absolutely foundational. It's Gustave Le Bon's famous work, The Crowd, a study of the popular mind. We're diving right into this because, honestly, whether you realize it or not, the invisible shift in societal power described in this book is actively shaping the world we're living in right this very second. Just look at this incredibly bold claim, straight from the source. The divine right of the masses is about to replace the divine right of kings. I mean, that instantly sets up the impossibly high stakes of what we're looking at today. We're not just talking about some basic group psychology here. We're talking about a fundamental pivot in the entire history of human civilization. The era of elite, solitary rulers dictating history, according to Le Bon, that is effectively over.
So that brings us to Section 1. The era of crowds and the crumbling of old pillars.
The source material argues that the old historical pillars that used to structure our society, the traditional religious, political, and social beliefs, well, they're tottering. And in their place, a totally new, singular, and frankly unignorable force is taking absolute dominance. Now, to really grasp this transition, we've got to look way beyond just voting. The text makes it crystal clear that the entry of the popular classes into political life isn't just about universal suffrage. It goes way deeper. It's about the masses forming syndicates, labor unions, and giant collective movements. It's about crowds slowly waking up to their own strength, literally to the point where they can dictate conduct to kings and leaders. The destinies of nations, the author argues, are no longer dreamed up in the private councils of princes. No, they're born right in the heart of the masses. And this really hits on the core thesis of the entire text. The unconscious replaces the conscious. Basically, the defining characteristic of our present age is substituting the conscious, deliberate activity of individuals with the unconscious action of crowds. The crucial takeaway here is that when people gather together, their rational individual minds basically take a backseat. A totally new, unconscious collective force grabs the steering wheel. But what does that actually look like in practice? Let's look at Section 2. The mind of the crowd, because as we'll see, it's about way more than just numbers. We need to clarify something absolutely vital right off the bat. Just packing a bunch of people into a city square doesn't automatically magically create a crowd. You need a specific catalyst. The source defines a psychological crowd as a gathering where individual personality completely vanishes. Poof! Gone. It gets replaced by this collective mental unity. Under certain influences, the ideas and feelings of every single person in that group align into one fixed direction. The text actually explains that your brain activity, that conscious thinking part of you, essentially disappears. What takes over is the medullary activity, the primitive, purely sentiment-driven, unconscious part of the human brain. You literally stop being a distinct individual and become a single cell operating inside a massive temporary organism. The text uses this absolutely brilliant ocean metaphor to illustrate the dynamic at play here. It suggests that the visible social phenomena we see every day on the news, the protests, the revolutions, those sudden massive shifts in public opinion, those are just the waves on the surface. They are merely the visible, surface-level expressions of immense, deep-lying unconscious disturbances that we actually know almost nothing about. So trying to understand a crowd by only looking at its immediate actions, it's literally like trying to understand the entire ocean by only looking at the foam on the top of the waves. Because of all this, crowds simply do not operate on logic. To wrap our heads around this, the author asks us to compare pure reason with practical reason. Pure reason is absolute truth, right? It tells us a cube is a cube, defined by rigorous, unchangeable mathematical formulas. But practical reason, that relies entirely on perspective and impression. If you look at a cube from a certain angle, it kind of looks like a pyramid. To your eye, a circle drawn on a piece of paper that's tilted away from you looks like an ellipse. The text argues that crowds operate entirely on this practical reason. They act on the illusion, the immediate image, the perspective, and they completely ignore the rigorous mathematical truth of the absolute. So, if they only act on illusion, are crowds entirely bad? That brings us to Section 3. Destructive microbes or unconscious genius. The great paradox. Let's look at the dark side of this first. The source material presents the crowd as this deeply paradoxical entity, and it is totally unsparing in describing their destructive traits. Because crowds are basically incapable of rational forethought and are governed purely by primitive instinct, they are highly destructive to the established order. The author actually uses a very vivid biological comparison here. He compares crowds to microbes that hasten the dissolution of enfeebled or dead bodies. Basically, whenever the structure of a civilization becomes rotten, it is always the masses that act as those microbes to bring about its final brutal downfall. But then, right when you think it's all doom and gloom, the author hits us with this incredible whiplash of a question. Yet, whence can this admirably organized production have arisen, except it be the outcome of the unconscious genius of crowds? What's he talking about? Language. Human language is incredibly complicated, intensely logical, and frankly marvelous. The most esteemed grammarians and academics out there can only write down the rules of a language. They are utterly incapable of inventing one from scratch. Only the vast, slow, unconscious genius of crowds over countless generations can actually create something as beautifully complex as language.
The explanation for this wild paradox really lies in the timeline of human evolution. Conscious reason is just too recent, but ancient instinct is immense. You see, conscious reason is a brand new attribute for humanity on an evolutionary scale. It's still way too imperfect to reveal the laws of the unconscious to us. But instinct, that driving force of the crowd, that is an ancient, incredibly powerful force of nature. Just look at the natural world. Beings governed exclusively by instinct accomplish acts of marvelous complexity all the time that totally astound us. The crowd operates on that exact same ancient, immense frequency.
Which leads us to Section 4, How to Lead the Masses. This is basically the statesman's playbook. If you're a modern leader trying to navigate an era where the masses hold the true power, you have to completely abandon traditional logic. The absolute golden rule derived from this text is this: leaders must seek what seduces the imagination, not what appeals to pure equity. If you try to lead a crowd using rules based on pure logic or strict fairness, you are going to fail. Period. The crowd just cannot process complex logic. Instead, a leader has to figure out what produces a strong, visceral visual impression on them.
The text gives this brilliantly clear, totally practical example of this: taxation. Imagine a legislator needs to raise money. They could use an indirect tax, a tax paid daily in tiny fractions of a penny on everyday goods. Because it's paid invisibly, just bit by bit every day, it goes completely unperceived, and the crowd tolerates it easily. Now, compare that to a proportional income tax that's paid in a single giant lump sum. Even if you proved mathematically that the lump sum tax was actually 10 times cheaper overall for the citizen than the daily indirect tax, the crowd would absolutely riot. Why? Because a relatively high lump sum strikes the imagination. It just feels immense. The pure reason of long-term math is completely irrelevant to the crowd. It's the sudden, jarring impression of losing a huge chunk of money all at once that triggers the protest.
And this right here is why this source states that a knowledge of the psychology of crowds is the absolute last resource of the statesman. Historical masters, people like Napoleon, they instinctively understood the psychology, at least for their own people. Today, legislators literally cannot afford to be ignorant of this. They aren't studying crowd psychology to rule the masses as absolute dictators like they used to. They're studying it simply so they aren't completely overwhelmed and destroyed by them. Ultimately, this builds to a rather chilling historical conclusion. Civilizations, the author asserts, involve fixed rules, discipline, a passing from the instinctive to the rational state, and actual forethought for the future. Historically speaking, these have only ever been created and directed by small intellectual aristocrats. Crowds, left entirely to themselves, are fundamentally incapable of this. Their rule, according to this analysis, is always tantamount to a barbarian phase. At the end of the day, crowds do not build, they dissolve. We're going to leave you with this final, highly provocative thought from the source material. Universal symptoms show us the rapid growth of the power of crowds. Whatever fate it may reserve for us, we shall have to submit to it. The era of crowds is absolutely here, and resisting it with mere words is useless. So the ultimate question you have to take away from this explainer is this: take a hard look at our current society. Are we currently in a phase of unconscious genius and growth, or are we actively witnessing the arrival of the microbes of dissolution? Thanks so much for joining us, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.